Welcome to the Alliance Service Dogs crash course, training your own service dog. My name is Claire. I am the owner and head trainer here at Alliance Service Dogs, and we're going to get started. So that's me and my dog, Ven. Ven is a 2.5-year-old border collie. You're going to see lots of him throughout the presentation here. He's a great model. As a bit of an overview, so we're going to cover a number of topics today. We're going to start off with a general definition of a service dog. What is a service dog? We're going to talk a little bit about how service dogs can help disabled individuals. And then we're going to go into access rights and service dogs laws in Ontario specifically, because that is where we are located. We serve the downtown Toronto area. And then finally, we're going to go over the Alliance Service Dogs training program, and we're going to look at how we can help people train their own assistance animals. So, what is a service dog? Service dogs are considered medical equipment in the eyes of the law. So at home, they might be super snuggly puppies. In public, they are by law considered medical equipment, just like a wheelchair. And service dogs are specially trained to mitigate their handler's disability. So there's a couple important bits there to highlight. They should be trained and they should be helping their handler navigate their handler's disability. So service dogs are held to very high standards of behavior in public for good reason, and they are allowed in most situations, nearly all situations, to accompany their handler in public spaces and while receiving services from businesses. And service dogs are not a couple things. So service dogs are not therapy dogs. There is a very big difference here. Therapy dogs are certified by private organizations, and they offer presence, comfort to at-risk populations and maybe schools or people in hospitals, so on and so forth. So they have no public access rights beyond what is granted by that private organization. Some examples in Toronto include the St. John's Ambulance Therapy Dog Organization and One Health Partners as well. So therapy dogs, very differently than service dogs, therapy dogs offer support and presence and comfort to people who are not their primary handler or owner. So they help a lot of different people, a variety of people, but they offer support outwardly. Service dogs are very individualized, and they help usually one single person with that person's disability. There's another little note here at the bottom. Emotional support animals, very common in the US, does not exist in Ontario. So that's just something to be aware of. Emotional support animals do not exist here at all. So we're going to talk a little bit about the potential disabilities that might be alleviated a little bit by a service animal, and then some potential tasks that can be taught to service dogs to then help their handler deal with their disabilities. So some potential disabilities. You'll see the list here. There are psychiatric disabilities. So very commonly, PTSD is a big one with service dogs, but many others, bipolar, panic disorders, anxiety, so on and so forth. Developmental, such as autism, and cognitive, such as traumatic brain injury. Those first three are the ones that Alliance Service Dogs specializes in. So I have extensive experience with working with dogs who help those three major types of disabilities. Now, I also have experience with most of the rest of the list, but we specialize a little bit in those first three. So potential other disabilities might include physical disabilities, so people who have some mobility issues. And then deaf individuals or hearing impaired individuals, blind or visually impaired individuals, Very importantly, if you are completely blind, 100% blind, it is highly recommended that you go to a very well-established nonprofit organization for your guide dog. Because mostly it is a very challenging process, I can help in certain situations with very mild visual impairment, but for the most part, for blind individuals, a dedicated organization is going to be best for you. Other types, potentially seizure disorders, epilepsy, diabetes, and a whole bunch of others, including chronic pain disorders, chronic migraines, so on and so forth. Obviously, this list is not exhaustive. There are a whole bunch else out there, and we may be able to help with lots of other things, but these are kind of the main ones. Now, some potential tasks that service dogs can be taught to mitigate disabilities. So very commonly alerting to an oncoming medical episode. For example, a dog might be able to sense that someone is having the buildup to a panic attack, and they might be able to alert that person. So alerting to an oncoming medical episode. Very important to note that seizure disorders and chronic migraines, it's very hard to teach, mostly impossible actually, to teach an alert to an oncoming seizure or migraine, because we don't quite know exactly what the dog is alerting to. With diabetes, we know that the dog is alerting to the change in blood sugar, and it's very straightforward at that point to receive samples of the person's body odor at different points of that blood sugar rise and fall, and then train the dog to alert to that particular scent. With seizure disorders and migraines, we don't know exactly what the dog is alerting to, so it is impossible to guarantee that we can teach the alert. What we can teach for seizures and migraines is a response, and sometimes the dog will then naturally pick up on alerting prior to. At that point, we can definitely shape it and mold it into what it might become later on. Moving on, a couple other things that can be taught: interruption of harmful behaviors, alerting to sounds if someone is deaf and is somewhere and someone's calling their name, or if there's an alarm going off, that kind of thing. Retrieving and carrying objects, particularly for physical disabilities, having the dog go get something or bring something to someone else might be particularly helpful. Guiding their handlers through the environment, that is mostly for those who are visually impaired, but can also be helpful for those who experience a dissociation in some situations. Pressure therapy, so deep pressure therapy is a really common one. It's particularly helpful for a number of different situations, definitely for psychiatric disabilities and very commonly for autism as well. Pressure therapy is really helpful. And then just last little example, pressing buttons and switches, again, mostly for physical disabilities, but can also be used to turn on the light if someone's having a nightmare, or go through the house ahead of someone who has PTSD and turning on the lights for them. So lots of different ways that dogs can be trained to help disabilities. Again, this is not a complete list whatsoever. There is a whole bunch else that can be taught. This is a little bit of an example. So we're going to move on a little bit. We're going to talk about access rights in Ontario. Now, I do want to be very clear, this is Ontario specific. Canada has a whole lot of different rules depending on the province. So this is going to be specific to Ontario. So according to the AODA, a service animal must be allowed to stay with the handler in public spaces and when accessing services, with very few exceptions. We're going to talk about the exceptions a little bit later, but that's the basics of it. Now, very importantly, handlers must be able to provide documentation from a regulated health professional if prompted by a service provider. So if someone's in a public space or a business and it is not pet friendly and they have their service dog with them, they should be able to provide documentation if asked to show the person that the dog is a service dog. That documentation is a letter from their doctor saying that they have a disability and that they require the use of a service dog to mitigate their disability. Now, that is the only thing that's legally required. Certification cards purchased online, certificates purchased online, all of that stuff does not count at all. And in fact, they're scams. So just be aware of that. Now, importantly, service dogs are not required to wear any kind of gear or signage to be considered legally a service dog, but in our experience, it's pretty helpful if they do. It just helps the public understand why the dog is there with you, and it can sometimes cut down a little bit on access issues. These are a couple infographics. Feel free to pause to read if you like. We have lots more down at the bottom there, allianceservicedogs.com/resources. There's a whole bunch, but these are kind of the two most relevant to what we just talked about. Now, I mentioned that there were a couple exceptions when it comes to access with service dogs. Here are some examples. So food preparation and manufacturing areas. So your service dog can't go with you into places where food is being prepared for consumption by the public. So for example, if you work in a restaurant and you work in the kitchen of a restaurant, your dog is not allowed there. Not only is it probably not safe for your dog, but it's a little bit of a risk in terms of contamination for that food. Air travel is a really confusing one, especially since the regulations are really dependent on certain different airlines and the CTA, the Canadian Transportation Agency, and things have just kind of really changed earlier this year as well, or last year. So there's kind of different requirements. And also, another note, public access laws, as I mentioned, differ across Canada depending on the province. So whether you're traveling inside of Canada or if you're traveling to other countries, the regulations are going to be different as well. So public access laws at your destination is probably going to be a challenge as well. So air travel is a little bit dicey. Now, for the most part, most airlines and the Canadian Transportation Agency allow dogs through if they have a record of training by a certified specialized service dog trainer, which I am. So students of the program should be fine. I can never guarantee access because it all depends on that one person that you end up working with in terms of airline access, but for the most part, should be fine. Now, the last one, housing, employment, and education, is also kind of a case-by-case basis. Now, landlords, employers, and educational institutions should be able to make accommodations for you 100% in most cases. However, they may be entitled to additional information beyond just the medical note. So that is something to be aware of as well. Now, there's one other very big exception. Very importantly, service dogs may be denied access if they are displaying disruptive behavior or if they are a danger to others. So a high standard of behavior in public is always expected and should be upheld. A little bit of a strange comparison, but it kind of works. If someone goes into a restaurant with a bunch of kids and the kids are really, really disruptive, they're running around, getting into other people's food or screaming really loud, they may be asked to leave. And it's kind of the same thing with service dogs. If your dog is barking consistently or is showing aggression or is not house trained, at that point, it's not an access issue in terms of your disability, it's simply a health and safety issue. So if your dog is really disruptive or dangerous, then you will be asked to leave. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the program itself. So before we get into the program, it's important to note that there are two major ways to obtain a service dog. There's kind of some gray area in between, but we're going to talk about the two major ones. There's obtaining a dog from a nonprofit or a organization that raises their own dogs, trains them themselves, and places them in homes. Or there is obtaining a dog, usually as a puppy, and then training the dog yourself to be a service dog. Both of these methods are completely 100% legal and valid. There are a lot of pros and cons to both. So it's really dependent on the particular handler, what they might prefer, how much personalization they need, how many resources they have, all of that kind of stuff. So at Alliance Service Dogs, we are help coach students with disabilities to train their own dogs. So we're not raising and training and placing dogs. We are specifically coaching people to train their own service dogs that they have obtained on their own. So overall, we can assist in pretty much any aspect of service dog partnership and training, all the way from before you even get your dog, so from selection of a prospect puppy, all the way to the end of career retirement. So at any point through it, we can help. Now, before entering the program, there's a couple of things that should be kind of checked off the list. So number one, of course, as required by law, you will need a doctor's note to be able to have a service animal. So you will have to talk to your doctor if you haven't already, and you're going to have to discuss with them, number one, whether a service animal is a good fit for your disability. And they will have to agree if it is appropriate for you. And then once you've talked to your doctor needs to write you that note. And then once you have it, we will have to see it prior to the first lesson. So before the initial assessment, I will have to see a copy of your doctor's note. That is all described on the application form and in the follow-up emails as well. So once you've got your doctor's note, then you can apply through the website. There's a big application form. Now, it might take a little bit of time to complete. Feel free to include as much or as little information as you like, but I will say things go much smoother if you include some detail in your application form, but some people feel more comfortable sharing it in person, and that's totally fine as well. So once you have filled out the application form, we will respond. And if we feel like we can help you and you might be a good fit for the program, then we will have you book the initial assessment. That's a 90-minute lesson. And it includes you, of course, your dog, of course, and then me, your instructor, and any support people as well that you'd like to bring along. So family, partners, whoever's going to be really involved in the process, welcome to join, of course. And then at the end, we will discuss your dog's continuation in the program, if it's a good fit, if it might not be the best fit. And that brings us to this slide, which is, can all dogs be service dogs with enough training? Unfortunately, no. So in fact, many dogs will not succeed. It's a very, very, very challenging process. For a number of reasons, and some of those reasons include genetic tendencies, which means that although training might be able to help us manage those things, some genetic tendencies will just never go away, and that means that your dog might never be an appropriate fit. Now, part of the assessment process and the continued assessment of your dog is trying to determine what those genetic tendencies might be. The initial assessment is not a guarantee, but we do our best. So at some point throughout the program, we might, if your dog is not doing as well as we'd hoped, we might have a discussion about your dog's abilities and the training progression. And if that comes up, dogs may potentially be washed, which is retiring from work, at that point, if the dog is not progressing as we'd hoped, or if there are some concerning behaviors that come up. In that case, it's really helpful to have a plan in place in case your dog needs to be washed or have a career change, essentially. There are a couple of options. Some people might benefit from the dog helping with their disability in the home only. So if the dog's not necessarily a great fit for public access, they may still be able to help, but in home or in pet only areas. Some dogs don't work out with tasking at all and might not work out with public access. And some people choose to keep those dogs as pets, and that's totally fine. And some other people choose to rehome that prospective service dog who didn't really work out and start over with a new dog. And that is also completely fine and valid. So all three options might be different based on your particular situation, but it's always good to have in mind what your preference would be for a career change if it has to happen. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the actual training process. So we've got a 5-phase program here, and this is another infographic. You're welcome to pause to read if you'd like, but it's all on our website as well. So training is completed usually through weekly private lessons. Later on in the process, some people choose to do lessons every 2 weeks, but it's really dependent on the individual, the team, and their progress throughout the program. Now, if people would prefer extra help, there's also supplemental day training spots where I would then pick up your dog, do some training, just me and your dog, and then drop your dog back off. So there's more information about that on our website as well. Students in the program have access to our exclusive training resources and materials that are specific to Alliance service dogs through our student portal. And all the progress for each individual team is tracked through their private team spreadsheet that is shareable for between your support system, but that allows us to track each individual team's progress throughout the program. And then throughout the program, there are going to be a few evaluations. So after each phase, there is a small evaluation to pass to the next phase. These ones are pretty low key, just making sure that all of the phase content has kind of stuck. After phase 5, though, that's where the final evaluation comes in. That's the big one. And we try to keep it as low pressure as possible. You can always repeat parts or the full evaluation, but students do need to pass that final evaluation to receive the letter of completion, and of course the branded vest as well. So a very important thing to talk about is the commitment. So for self-training your own service dog, it is quite a bit of a commitment in terms of time, effort, and money. So in terms of time, each phase of the 5-phase program takes about 3 to 6 months to complete. So overall, depending on the dog's kind of level of initial training, age, a number of other factors, it might take 1 to 2 years before the dog is really working reliably. Sometimes it takes longer. That's totally fine. Some dogs and some teams require a little bit more time. There's no kind of at 2 years you have to be done. That doesn't exist. But it might take that amount of time to get to a really reliable working point. It also is really hard to say when a team is going to be finished training because it completely depends very strongly on the amount of practice done by the team between lessons. So if you're only practicing during that 1 hour per week where I see you, it might take a long time to get to that final point. But if you're doing your practice diligently, then you're going to be speeding through that content pretty well, and your dog should have a pretty good time. Now, in terms of cost, this is always the big question, and unfortunately, I don't have a very strict answer for you because, again, it varies a lot. And it's going to vary on a number of variables, including what training is necessary. So Does the dog need to go into public access training? Does the dog need to have very, very extensive tasking? Or is it a little bit easier to train the tasking, so on and so forth? If your dog has done previous training and they're really strong with their foundations, the amount of time and money that you're going to spend with me is probably going to be a little bit less. How fast the training progresses. Is your dog like a super quick learner? Are you a really quick learner? If so, might be a little bit of a shorter period of time, which means a little bit less money. And handler support needs as well. It is totally fine if a certain handler needs a little bit more cheerleading, hand-holding through the process. This is a very challenging process. I'm going to say that a whole bunch of times. It's a very difficult process to get through. So if handlers need a little bit more consulting with me and that kind of stuff, that's totally fine. It's going to be a little bit more expensive, but it's totally fine. Other people might be really independent, might do a whole bunch of self-study, and that might be a little bit cheaper for them in terms of their engagement with the program. Now, pretty standard baseline for kind of puppy to graduate might be about 2 years. Full public access training, maybe moderate task training, about $4,000 over those 2 years should be an accurate estimate. But again, it varies widely. There's also some things to consider about our specific program and if it might be a good fit for you and your team. So the handler, on the handler side, of course, as I've mentioned multiple times, they must be professionally diagnosed with a life-limiting disability. So this is a legal requirement for service dogs, and they have to have that letter from their medical provider. So they are professionally diagnosed with a disability. Number two, they should be able to communicate honestly and openly about their disability and their needs and their limitations. We don't need to know everything about your life, although I love to chat, but I don't need to know all the details. What I do really need to know is what are common triggers that might pop up in a lesson. I want to avoid stressors with my teams as much as possible. If the handler is really stressed out during a lesson, training is not going to go smoothly. There's not going to be a lot of learning happening, and that's not fun for anybody. So I need to be able to coach appropriately and to help my clients appropriately, which means I need to have a certain amount of knowledge about their particular experience with their disability. Thirdly, as mentioned in the commitment part, the self-training program does require a certain amount of resources. So time, energy, and money are the biggest ones. And so you have to be ready to pour some of that into this process in order to find some success. And then finally, very important to note, Alliance Service Dogs uses mostly positive reinforcement and fully force-free techniques. So we are not going to use strong aversives or intimidation or force or any kind of that stuff to get behavior from our dogs. So handlers must be open to using positive reinforcement, solely force-free techniques. And we're going to talk about the dog as well. Now, most of the dog stuff is going to be covered in the assessment as well. So part of what I'm going to be doing during the initial assessment is determining where your dog falls on these types of scales. So it's okay if you don't completely know where your dog is at. That's totally fine. However, in terms of being a good prospect, they should be physically healthy, fit, and ideally under 4 years of age. So service dog training and work it's work. It's physically active, it's physically demanding, and the dog needs to be healthy and fit to do it properly and in a way that is compassionate to the dog as well. So that is a really important thing to consider. Your dog should also be generally confident, sociable, temperamentally sound, and without any anxiety or aggression issues. Now, again, this is a very big component of the initial assessment, so don't worry if you're not super sure on that side, it's all good. Very important part, your dog should be motivated to work for food. So throughout training, food is going to be our number one tool in terms of teaching our dogs how to perform behaviors, especially the really, really difficult ones like tasking. Food is the best tool to use for this purpose. And if your dog's not motivated to work for food, it's going to be very, very, very difficult, for you to almost impossible, to teach your dog those very challenging behaviors. And finally, it's really important that your dog is suitable for the particular tasks that you might require them to perform. So, for example, if you require some mobility assistance in terms of really physical things that the dog needs to do, like bracing or guide work, if you have a really small dog, obviously that's not going to be appropriate. Of course, that's a really obvious example. There are a number of other examples that I will work with you with in the initial assessment to determine whether your dog might be a good fit for the particular tasks that you require. All right. So, as a bit of a summary, so service dogs are specifically trained to assist a disabled person in their daily life. And here at Alliance Service Dogs, we mostly help handlers train their own service dog using, of course, positive reinforcement methods. And not all dogs will make it to the end. The training process is very extensive and requires a certain type of dog. And to get started, what you have to do is number one, obtain a letter from your doctor if you don't already have it. That is a very big conversation to have with your medical provider. And once that is done, you can fill out the application form on our website. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Please let us know if you have any questions at all. You can reach us over email, admin@allianceservicedogs.com. We also have a multitude of social media, and our website is on there as well, of course.